former Commissioner for Body Corporate and Community Management Advisor with Hynes Legal. With me, literally, Frank Higginson, partner at Hynes Legal. Frank, welcome.
Hello, everyone. I don't know whether to look at you or the camera, but we'll figure that out at some stage.
Oh, yeah. You may have noticed a slight difference in our webinar presentation today. We are absolutely 100% live, in the flesh, in person. Hynes is having a team day today, and we have stepped out of that to present today's webinar. So you get the advantage of both of us, same time, same place, same camera. What more could you want on a Thursday afternoon, I ask you? Not much more, I wouldn't have thought. Thanks everybody for tuning in, and thanks for all of you who have signed up for reminders. It's the best way of finding out what we've got on this month, and also for getting some content afterwards. Don't forget also, you can chuck some questions up live on the YouTube chat function. It's fair to say, Frank, we have a stack of content in a very short time today.
Yes, well, this was originally a half-hour webinar on getting on and off committees, and on was part one and off is part two, and we actually think we've got a part three, but we'll keep that for the end.
We do, yeah. So if you do have questions, please chuck them on. We'll try and get to as many of those as possible. But as Frank said, we did our first one of these back in April, ambitiously, as it turned out. We thought we'd try both on and off committees at the same time, but we only got through the on bit. And that was good, but we think most of the attention, given its human nature, Frank, will be on the off bit. Yeah, this is the bit when Frank and I do a webinar or a seminar or we speak to people. This is usually, Frank, isn't it, the thing that people are most interested in?
And as we were bouncing around talking to people about the changes, well, not changes, the new modules that came in on the 1st of March, this was probably the most often asked question from the floor, as much as nothing really changed. So it just shows how near and dear regime change can be for people in bodies corporate. So today, it's a bit interesting. I think probably we're going to start with dealing with some of the furphies that we have, and then talk about how committee members do come off committees. And that is, I suppose, Chris, one of the things, in a sense, that we might have a slight difference of opinion on to a degree. I've done a little bit of prep for this one because we're in the same room, is whether it is worthwhile creating regime change to start with. We've got slightly opposite views on this. I might open to you to that, Chris.
Thank you very much. Look, I think anybody who's ever heard me speak would know that I always compare being on being part of the body corporate to politics. It's the same sort of deal, particularly when we talk about this kind of thing. Thank you for your nice comment there, Paul, by the way. Particularly when we talk about getting off committees, because this is very much like a party room coup in Canberra, isn't it, Frank? It's about you in the process of trying to initiate regime change. As we've seen, and look, I take the view that you've got to always be careful what you wish for under these circumstances. It's all well and good to put up your hand and say, I want to get rid of the chairperson, I want to get rid of the secretary, I want to get rid of the treasurer, replace the whole committee, start again. Frank, you've got an idea, I suppose, that can actually be the worthwhile strategy in some cases.
And I mean, we're in the middle of a couple of these right now, as it turns out. And I suppose for me, the circumstances that might justify it is where the committee is running completely off the grid. And we see it regularly. You know, I mean, committees are volunteers, they're there, they've got to act reasonably, but quite often they can run amok if you've got an apathetic bunch of owners who just don't bother to put their hands up. You might have 3 or 4, well, you've got 3 people on a committee, and the simplest example is they might be charging off hell-bent into some legal proceeding, and owners don't actually know what's going on. I mean, I'm meeting with a client next week where the body corporate committee has already spent 15 grand in a 30-lot scheme on legal advice, and not a single one of the owners actually knows about it.
Okay.
So we're starting that one with, you know what, it's time for you to go, and we're going to educate the owners about why. But we'll talk about how that might happen in due course, I suppose.
I think that's fair enough. There probably are some instances where changing at least one committee member is probably not a bad idea. I think one point, Frank, that we are in total agreement on, it's not necessarily the first option that you go to.
No, absolutely.
So look, today How do you remove? How do you get off? How do you cease being on the committee? We think, much like getting on committees, this boils down to two main things, and we're going to split that up roughly into, there are some statutory ways to get off a committee, that is things that are prescribed under legislation, and then there are a couple of other things, and we call those body corporate initiated ways. But first, Frank, let's address some of the furphies. Now, some of you might chuckle when you hear some of these, but I can assure you, and so can Frank, we have heard these probably multiple times in multiple contexts.
Didn't take us long to come up with this list, did it?
It's actually a long list, this one. So these are the furphies about not being able to be on a committee any longer.
You can't be on the committee because?
Number one, you've breached a bylaw. Really? Is that right, Frank?
No, there's no ability to remove people, or there's no, I suppose, removal of your right to be on a committee whether you've breached a bylaw or not.
Let's face it, if that were the case, there probably wouldn't be a functioning committee in Queensland, Frank. So that's right. Number two, there are no such thing as term limits on committee. So it's not like being the President of the United States where you get 2 terms and that's it. You can have as many as you like in Queensland. Number three, and this one might shock a few people, a breach of the code of conduct for committee members is not grounds for excluding someone to be on the committee. That doesn't sound right to me, Frank, at all.
Alleged breach or actual proven breach in itself is not a basis for not being on a committee.
Yep. And again, if you want to use the political comparison again, simply because somebody's been dismissed from the cabinet and sent to the backbenches, you see them come back all the time.
Don't misuse their entitlements.
Happen?
Helicopter trips to Bendigo or whatever it was. Comcast.
Absolutely. The next furphy, the idea that if you've already been voted off the committee, you can't go back. We've heard that one before.
And that actually came up in the discussion papers. So that was actually the discussion paper that prompted, in a sense, well, not prompted, you'd say, was a substantial part of the new modules that we're now dealing with. So a question was asked there is, if a committee member has been voted off a committee as opposed to just rolled around through the AGM and been removed automatically, should they be prevented from being back on that committee for a period of time? The question was asked and wasn't taken up. So just because you're being voted off, you can be voted off today, and if you've nominated for the AGM and the AGM's tomorrow, you can be straight back on if you don't have any competition.
If we want to use the political comparison again, it didn't stop Gillard, it didn't stop Rudd.
Didn't stop Rudd, did he?
No,
Later off the island, I'm going to get my way back on.
Absolutely, why not? The next one, there is no such thing as a vote of confidence in a body corporate committee. A vote of no confidence in a body corporate committee. It just doesn't exist. There's no provision for it, Frank, is there?
At general meeting and committee meeting level. So you might have 6 committee members have a vote of no confidence in Chris's capacity as chair, but it's meaningless. And the same at general meeting. There's absolutely, I mean, in theory, it's a vote that should be ruled out of order because it's not capable of being given legal effect. We see that one quite a bit as well. I
think that's also one of the really good examples of where body corporate governance differs greatly from other kinds of governance. And I think one of the reasons why we see suggestions of votes of no confidence is people coming from the corporate sector or the not-for-profit sector where they're used to that sort of thing. It just does not exist in the body corporate context. Next, and my favourite, no such thing as a public lynching or stoning or in the stocks with tomatoes. Also, on that theme, Frank, no such thing about demanding an apology and then ceasing to be on the committee if you don't give the apology, is there?
Absolutely. And I mean, you see the odd commissioner's application asking for an order that an apology be made by person X. That's as much as adjudicators have the ability to make orders that are just and equitable in the circumstances. That's probably not one they're going to go to, is it?
No.
Next up, and surprisingly enough, bankruptcy. Doesn't prevent you from being on a committee. It might prevent you from being a director of a company, but if Chris owned a lot and Chris appointed me as his corporate nominee or his power of attorney or otherwise, and I'm a bankrupt, I can go on that committee.
That's really surprising, isn't it, Frank? I mean, and I think there'd be a few people watching this who'd be a bit shocked by that one. I suppose then, Frank, just we've got a bit of time up our sleeve, I think. If we extend that a bit further, so if I am a bankrupt and we've established that that doesn't prevent me from being on the committee, is there anything stopping you letting all of the other owners know before the election that I'm a bankrupt?
No. No, you'd want to make sure you're factual about it, and you'd want to go and do your bankruptcy search, and you might even attach that to your circular to all owners. But there is, it's not, I suppose, from a defamation perspective, the ultimate defence to any accusation of defamation is truth. So if it's true that you're a bankrupt and you're letting everyone know that so-and-so is a bankrupt, then that's a factual thing. No problem at all.
That's right. And then if people go ahead and vote for you to be treasurer, for argument's sake, under those circumstances, well, there you go. That's it. On a related theme, I've often seen this one as well. People have said, oh, I've heard that blah, blah on the committee or who's running for the committee was recently in court on some kind of charge. Does that preclude them from being on the committee? The answer is no.
Innocent until proven guilty. So
And then let's pursue that one even further. So guilty of what, Frank?
An indictable offence. So an indictable offence, not that I did really well in criminal law in 1993 when I did it, just scraped through that one. But an indictable offence is effectively a charge which is capable of being tried by jury. So it's a relatively serious one. And it needs to be a conviction of an indictable offence. So before you start, I suppose, throwing those sorts of stones around, and those things can run for years. So, and it's only really while you are a committee member is that conviction.
And so I think this is a scenario in which you need to be so super careful if you are out there throwing aspersions. If you're out there throwing aspersions about John Smith from Unit 1, who's running for the committee, was in court on a driving charge last week. Depends what the driving charge is, and most of all depends if they're actually convicted or not. There is a big gulf between a charge and a conviction in any scenario, but in this one in particular. So yeah, you've just got to be so careful about those sorts of things. So as we say, they're the myths which commonly exist about getting off, removing, ceasing to be on a committee. With that in mind, how about we focus on the things which actually do remove you from a committee, Frank? And as we said before, we split this up into what we call statutory. These are the triggers under the legislation which do it, and then the other ones. So first of all, Frank, eligibility is the statutory one, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, the first way to come off a committee is you die.
Grim way of putting it, Frank.
Very obvious, but there you go.
Yeah. So it all comes back to this question of eligibility, and it's probably worth exploring this just for a second. So you've got to be eligible to be on the committee in the first place. Just because you're eligible doesn't mean that you get on the committee, of course. So it's about achieving the threshold. If we use our political analogy again, you've got to be, what was it, an Australian citizen?
Well, citizen in another country, isn't it? Which happens by birth and all those sort of various things that various people found out.
Yeah. So if you cease to be eligible, you cease to be on the committee. And as Frank said, the most obvious way that you do that is if you die. But another way, if you do that, Frank, is if you sell your lot. But
we have seen this before, and this is, I suppose, the example to which some people go. Again, let's assume for a second that Chris owns his lot, Chris sells. What Chris can do is still remain on that committee if he goes, well, and become a part of the committee if he goes and becomes appointed by another lot owner, again, as a corporate nominee, under a power of attorney or otherwise. And I've seen that a couple of times. Yeah. So even though that committee member, in that sense, no longer owns a lot, they're representing another lot owner, and they're well and truly entitled to be on that committee. And we actually ran an application at one stage where it continued through, even though it hadn't been voted on in that capacity. Now, I don't quite think the decision was right, but as sometimes happens in adjudications, the adjudicator went with what they thought was just and equitable, and the issue was that this person had the support of the body corporate by about 60 votes to 5, and therefore followed it through and away you went.
So numbers again, Frank.
Yes,
stay tuned at the end of today for a little bit more about numbers. I've had it put to me once before that if you are putting your lot up for sale, then that should preclude you from being on the committee. And the answer to that is no as well, because the mere fact of listing your lot for sale does not mean that you cease to be on the committee. It's got to be, I think it would be the point at which the...
Well, and this is the argument we had in that decision. That decision said you still, as long as you're a member of the role, as long as you're on the body corporate roll, you're still a member of the body corporate, even though the sale had taken place and settled 3 months previously because the buyer hadn't sent through the notification to change the ownership of the lot. Anyway, so that's sort of not into that technical detail, but that was a really interesting one at the time.
Definitely. Another way that somebody ceases to be eligible is the apathy rule, Frank, isn't it?
You don't show up for 2 meetings in a row without the consent of the committee, gone. And you can show up personally, now you can show up electronically, or you can also show up as a proxy for a committee member. So if I can't go and I give my proxy to Chris to go for me, then effectively he is attending for me, which means I've attended that meeting. But if you simply don't bother to do any of that stuff for 2 meetings in a row, you're gone.
And I think that's one of the similarities in this case between body corporate governance and other kinds of governance, because that clause, that provision turns up in a lot of other types of governance arrangements, I think.
Absolutely.
And it makes sense, doesn't it? Because if you're going to be on the committee of any kind of governing body, it's assumed that you have volunteered to be there, you've got the time and wherewithal to do it. So if you're not turning up to participate in your role, why should you stay? Makes sense to me. We talked a little bit before, Frank, about being charged with something, but tell us a bit about indictable offences.
Well, indictable offences are offences that the defendant can elect to be tried by jury. So, you don't see in lower level courts, magistrates court particularly, a lot of jury trials. You certainly see them in Supreme Courts. You go to murders and all those sorts of things, and sometimes at district court level. So if someone is convicted of an indictable offence, then they're off the committee at that point in time, automatically without any further action on their part. I suppose the other way you can get off a committee is you resign. And one of those things, and I suppose back to politics, back to employment, resignations don't have to be accepted by anything else. It's the same as being a director of a company in that sense. If you choose to go and you resign, that's it. And I think from my perspective, you can resign as at a date. So what are we today? 6th of May. 6th of May, day before Chris's birthday, everyone. Chris could say, or I could say, you know what, I've had enough of this. As at the end of May, I'm gone. And then you go through that committee replacement process, which we spoke about 2 weeks ago or a week ago, or whatever it was, where the committee's got to fill that casual vacancy.
Yeah, so we don't think there's anything wrong with post-dating resignations.
Or resigning as at a date in time.
Yep, absolutely. The next way somebody ceases to be eligible is if they become an associate. In 100 words or less, Frank, what's an associate?
People that are associates of the caretaking service contractor, or associates of people that run a letting business, or associates of the body corporate manager are automatically ineligible to be committee members. Associate is, dare I say this, section 309 of the Act. And effectively, you go through it, it's a family member, it's a person that's in some form of employment. And the catch-all really is someone that is used to acting under the instructions of another person.
Yep.
So, for example, if one of our staff members who are watching this in an adjoining room, if I own the management rights for a building, Miles happened to put his hand up to go on committee as a nominee for someone else, then from my perspective, he would be an associate of mine because as his employer, he's used to acting under my instructions. So he would be ineligible to be on the committee as at the date I own the management rights.
I think that's a really good point, Frank, because you're kind of highlighting there why that legislation is actually in place. The idea that a relationship exists and there's an ability to influence. And so we're trying to get to this idea that if you're on a committee, then you are exercising some form of free will and participating for the benefit of all. Yeah. Finally, and then we've got a couple of questions there. Thanks for that. We'll get to those in just a tick. But finally, on the eligibility front, debtor members, Frank. So this is a new thing, isn't it?
It is a new thing. So for those of you that watched all of our webinars on the new modules, a new definition was created in the modules where a committee member who's unfinancial, but they're unfinancial or the person that nominated them is unfinancial, is what's called now a debtor member. It doesn't mean they're not on the committee, but it means they don't have a vote for so long as they or the person that nominated them is unfinancial. So it's not quite a removal, but it's a removal in the sense of the inability to participate in the voting affairs of the committee.
Which renders it pointless at that point, doesn't it? Because they're doing nothing.
Yeah. In purgatory.
Yeah, that's right. Body corporate purgatory. I love it. So they're the statutory triggers, and then there are the ones that are initiated within the body corporate. So this is where the lot owners exercising their rights as voters can potentially affect change to the committee.
Yes, and this is also interesting because this is one of the elements of the new modules that arrived. So committee members have a code of conduct through which they must comply, and the legislation, the modules, set out a fairly specific process about the removal of a committee member for a breach of the code of conduct, which requires the issuing of a breach notice, an opportunity for owners to vote on a general meeting, obviously an opportunity for the affected committee member to respond to that and contest it. And a big, long-winded, drawn-out process that is, I suppose, theoretically possible. We get code of conduct questions all the time, but practically useless.
Yep.
Because the other way that is now specifically in the legislation, so previously it's always been there, but it wasn't really noted as an express right. A committee member is voted in at an AGM and is there until, I suppose, one of a better phrase, saying in politics, there's a spill, not that there's a spill, but at the end of the next AGM, all of the positions are declared vacant and you have your committee election. So the new committee is elected at the next AGM. So committee members have a 12-month window, other than if they become ineligible for the reasons we've spoken about, or they're removed. And they can be removed by an ordinary resolution at general meeting without cause. And that's the difference for me with the code of conduct element. So
and that's where you've got to, I think, Frank, that's where you've got to be really careful. If you're watching this and you're thinking, oh, that's what I need to do, I'm going to remove blah, blah committee member, well and good. Ordinary resolution at the general meeting, no reason that is needed. The instant you mention the phrase code of conduct, you are obliged to follow that convoluted process that Frank mentioned. So you either say nothing at all and seek removal, or you seek removal based upon code of conduct. And I know that some people would think, oh, we need to do the code of conduct because that's the formal process, and this idea that you will litigate all the failings of that person in public practically has no effect.
No. And that's the thing. It's like, I've lost count of these conversations I've had over the years. Why would you possibly, if you go in a general meeting, why would you run something that you have to prove cause as opposed to something which is just purely a vote because it's the will of the people without having to prove anything? And so what they did in the latest iteration of the modules is they expressly included a right to remove committee members by ordinary resolution. I mean, suppose in that sense, by expressly included, it was always there, but now it's actually part of the section. So it's very clear that that is clearly what is allowed to make it, I'm going to say clear again, which is really bad, so I apologise for that. And certainly as part of the process when we were talking about the changes to the modules, one of the questions that was asked in the sense was, why don't you just remove the code of conduct provisions in relation to removal of committee members, because you've got a far more pragmatic way to approach it here, and clearly that didn't happen. But it's, you know, I don't stop doing code of conduct stuff.
Yeah.
What we use as a stick, but to remove a committee member, it's pointless.
And let's just clarify best practice and process. You have to requisition the extraordinary general meeting, so that's 25% of all eligible voters. To have the extraordinary general meeting, I think best practice, we would recommend, Frank, that you remove John Smith and appoint blah, blah.
Yeah, there's quite a few tricks with this one. You know, we're trying to give people the ability to sort of arm themselves with information, but there's a lot of ways that these things can go wrong. And usually it's clearly, if you're having a crack at the committee's not going to vote to remove itself. As much as sometimes there can be splits in committees, and then there's rights for committees who ignore requisition meetings for other committee members to do things about it. But there are a few technical traps you can fall down if you're going to head down that process, which is way beyond what we're talking about today. But that is, if there's not eligibility criteria, regime change in its purest sense is vote Chris out, vote Frank on.
Yeah. And it's a point I always make to people. You want to vote someone off the committee? Great. you need to make sure you've got somebody to replace them, and you need to make sure that they're going to be at least as good or at least not as terrible. Yes.
Well, I remember seeing Alan Water on the cricket show 1,000 years ago when at one stage the Australian cricket team wasn't performing, and the question was being asked, well, we've got to drop so-and-so. I can't even remember who the player was. It might have been Mike Hussey at the time. And Alan Water's response as a selector at the time was, that's great. Who are you going to replace him with? So he mightn't be doing all that well, but who's going to do better?
It's a really good question. That often stumps people, that one. We've just got a few minutes left, and Frank and I want to do a quick sum up and a couple of best practice tips. But before we get there, we might try the questions. Karen, thank you, Karen, for your question. Karen, this is a really good question. If a committee member is removed by owners and not replaced at the general meeting, can the committee fill the position with the same member? Yeah.
Yes.
However, well, I would then go on to say, well, technically, yes, they can, but that's a really provocative thing to do, isn't it? And if you're the committee and you decide to fill the casual vacancy with the person who all of the voters decided they'd had enough of, why would you do that to yourself?
Well, it's certainly going to be good for the body corporate managers because there's another EGM coming up that'll be outside their standard fee and they get to charge for it.
Absolutely. So the answer is technically yes, but from a strategic point of view, it would bamboozle me as to why anyone would do that. Yeah, it is, big time. Julia, I know you're a regular watcher. Thank you. Is it? I think this comes back to the issue about missing 2 meetings in a row. Is it enough that they send a voting paper not turning up 2 meetings in a row?
No, I think when I actually looked at that section, it's attendance. So attendance is personally, via electronic means if the committee's resolved that way, or by appointing a proxy. So just sending in a voting paper to the actual, and I suppose this is one of the things, on committee agendas, usually they're not structured by way of specific motions like they are for general meetings. You know, general meetings, confirm minutes of last meeting, budgets, blah, 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 yes, no, whatever. Committee meetings might be a discussion about Chris Irons' application to keep his pet. So there's not actually a resolution there in a sense to vote yes or no to. And I think that's where the government's going back towards in terms of if you want to participate in the decision-making at committee level, then show up. And that's discussion as opposed to pure voting.
I think that's right, Frank. And another comment there from Karen. Karen wants to nominate Frank and I to be on both buildings committees. We are available to do that for the right price, of course. But look, to sum up, I think we talked about getting on committees in the previous webinar. Now we're talking about getting off committees. I think, and you hit the nail on the head just before, Frank, this is complex stuff and it can be really tricky and really intricate stuff.
Because it really is, if you're knocking someone on the head from a leadership position, it can be quite embarrassing. And we have seen them, and I've said this to clients all the time in these sort of disputes, is that it's not uncommon for the person who is removed or kicked off or voted down or whatever it is to sell their lot and leave. I've seen that quite a bit.
So it has big implications. So I think that the point that we would always make is you really should be thinking about getting some advice or getting yourself informed on these issues, because if you make a tactical misstep in this process, not only does it all fail more than likely, but as Frank has just alluded to, the long-term consequences can be really significant. You might be setting yourself up for a world of grief if you have not got this plotted out correctly and ideally.
It's a political campaign.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. Another question there from Secretary VG2. Can a proxy be a non-committee member but an owner?
No. The committee member can only appoint another committee member as their proxy. End of story. So that is, the committee is that number of people that's been elected for that particular year, and those are the people that will be participating in the decision making. Otherwise, I suppose you'd almost have committees by stealth.
Yes, yeah. We come back to my analogy about Kramer and Jerry's father and how he was trying to control Kramer as a puppet regime for the condo board there. Go back and watch that episode, everyone. This probably does it in a lot more entertaining fashion than we're doing. I think the point that we want to leave everyone with this discussion is that, well, 2 things. Number one, there is a lot of discussion about committees, getting on committees, getting off committees. We're all forever being asked about committee membership. It can be distilled into a couple of relatively straightforward categories, into on and off, but you need to, as much as you need to be aware of those, you need to be aware of the incorrect ones, and we've addressed a lot of them today. There's a lot of misinformation that floats around about this sort of thing. Very easy to get off track about it. You need to be really focused on this sort of thing. And also, I think, Frank, you need to be sure you want to go down this path.
Absolutely.
Now, the second point, just a bit of a preview of coming attractions. We've talked a little bit about it today, and we talked a little bit about it in the first webinar that we did about on and off committees. Stay tuned for our webinar on, Frank, have you got the numbers?
We're going to go a little bit off the reservation and stop talking pure legal stuff for a bit and start talking about how to actually deal with and, I suppose, defend the sort of actions that we've been talking about today. So that will be interesting.
That will be a good one. Make sure you subscribe, because that's how you'll find out when that one will be on. Thank you, everybody, for joining us in this slightly different webinar today. I think it's worked well, actually. As I say, don't forget to subscribe. That's how you find out what's going on. That's how you get a bit of content. Stay tuned next week. I forget what we're doing next week.
I can't remember.
But it's going to be good.
They always are.
They always are. Frank, as always, thank you.
And happy birthday for tomorrow again, Chris.
Thank you, Frank.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone. We will see